A 10-year-old girl standing in the middle of an airplane aisle, her voice steady and unwavering, looking a grown woman dead in the eye and saying, "My father owns this airline. And you're about to find out what happens when you disrespect his children." The flight attendants froze. Passengers stopped mid-conversation. And that woman? She laughed. She actually laughed, thinking it was some kind of joke. But in the next 30 minutes, her laughter would turn to panic, her smirk would crumble, and she'd be escorted off that plane in front of everyone. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this all started, because what happened on Flight 447 wasn't just about one confrontation. It was about dignity, courage, and a little girl who refused to be made small. It was a crisp Tuesday morning at JFK Airport in New York City. Terminal 4 buzzed with the usual chaos of travelers rushing to gates, dragging oversized luggage, and clutching overpriced coffee cups like lifelines. But in the first-class boarding lane for Sky-High Airlines Flight 447 to Los Angeles, there was a moment of unusual calm. That's when you would have seen them, the Williams family. Amara Williams was 10 years old, but if you saw her, you'd swear she carried herself like someone much older. She had this quiet confidence, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. Her dark skin glowed under the airport's fluorescent lights, and her hair was styled in neat cornrow braids that cascaded down her back, each one adorned with small gold beads that caught the light when she moved. She wore a simple but elegant navy blue dress with white sneakers, and slung over her shoulder was a small backpack. But the most important thing she carried wasn't in that backpack. It was clutched in her left hand, a worn brown leather journal with gold-embossed edges. That journal had belonged to her mother. Walking beside Amara were her twin brothers, Malik and Mason. 7 years old, identical in every way except for the tiny mole on Malik's left cheek. They were bundles of energy, practically bouncing as they walked, their matching superhero backpacks bobbing up and down. Malik kept asking questions about the plane, about whether they'd see clouds up close, about whether the snacks would be good. Mason was already planning what games they'd play on their tablets once they were in the air. They were loud, excitable, and completely unaware of the stares they were attracting as they entered the first-class cabin. Following closely behind was Mrs. Chin, their nanny. She was in her 50s, with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled and silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun. Mrs. Chen had been with the Williams family for 2 years, ever since Amara's mother passed away. She was warm but firm, the type of woman who could comfort you with a hug and then make you finish your homework in the same breath. As they boarded, she kept one hand on Mason's shoulder, gently steering him down the narrow aisle. Their seats were 1A through 1D, right at the very front of first class. The best seats on the plane. Amara took 1A by the window, Malik and Mason scrambled into 1B and 1C, and Mrs. Chun settled into 1D on the aisle. As the boys immediately started fiddling with the entertainment screens and pressing every button they could find, Amara carefully placed her backpack in the overhead compartment. Then she helped Malik with his backpack because he couldn't quite reach, and did the same for Mason, who was too distracted by the window to notice. Once settled, Amara opened her leather journal. Tucked inside the front cover was a photograph, slightly faded at the edges. It showed a beautiful woman with the same warm brown skin as Amara, the same bright eyes, wearing a sundress and laughing at something off camera. Amara's mother. She'd been gone for 3 years now, but Amara looked at this photo every single day. She traced her finger along the edge of the picture, lost in memory for just a moment. Mrs. Chin leaned over and spoke softly. "Your father's meeting should be finished by the time we land. He'll be waiting at the gate for you." Amara nodded, closing the journal carefully and tucking it into the seat pocket in front of her. "I know. He texted me this morning." Her voice was steady, matter-of-fact. She was used to her father's busy schedule. David Williams was always in meetings, always on calls, always running something. But he always made time for his children. The flight attendants were making their rounds, welcoming passengers with practiced smiles and offering champagne to the adults and juice boxes to the kids. Malik chose apple juice. Mason wanted orange. Amara politely declined, saying she'd wait until after takeoff. Everything seemed perfect. Everything seemed normal. And then she boarded. Linda Hutchinson. Late 40s, every inch of her screaming wealth and status. She wore a cream-colored designer pantsuit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, with a silk scarf draped artfully around her neck. Her blonde hair was styled in that effortless way that actually takes an hour and a professional to achieve. Diamond studs glittered in her ears. Her designer handbag, with its unmistakable interlocking logo, hung from her forearm. She carried herself like someone who'd never been told no in her entire life. Her seat was 1E, directly across the aisle from the Williams family. As she approached, wheeling her expensive carry-on behind her, she glanced at her boarding pass, then at the seat numbers, then at the family occupying the row across from hers. And that's when it happened. That double take. That fraction of a second where her expression shifted from neutral to surprised to something else entirely. Her eyes widened just slightly. Her pace slowed. And if you were watching closely, you would have seen her grip tighten on her handbag. She stopped in the aisle, looking at her boarding pass again as if it might have changed in the last 3 seconds. She checked the seat number above 1E. She looked at the Williams family again. Malik was still chattering away about clouds. Mason was pointing out the window. Mrs. Chun was helping them buckle their seatbelts. Amara was reading the safety information card, because that's the kind of responsible child she was. They weren't doing anything wrong. They weren't bothering anyone. They were just existing in their assigned seats. But to Linda Hutchinson, something about this picture didn't sit right. She placed her carry-on in the overhead compartment, her movements suddenly stiff and deliberate. As she lowered herself into seat 1E, she pulled her handbag close to her body, clutching it against her side as if someone might snatch it away. Her eyes darted toward the Williams family. Then away, then back again. She shifted in her seat, adjusted her scarf, checked her phone, and then very deliberately pulled out her own boarding pass to examine it one more time, as if the airline might have made some catastrophic error. The flight attendant passed by with a smile. "Can I get you anything, ma'am?" Linda's voice was clipped. "I'm fine. Just confirming my seat assignment." The flight attendant glanced at the boarding pass. "Yes, ma'am, you're all set." Linda's lips pressed into a thin line. "I see." Across the aisle, Amara noticed everything. She was 10, but she wasn't naive. She'd seen that look before. The double take. The purse clutching. The way some people's faces changed when they saw her and her brothers in spaces they didn't expect to see them. Her mother had prepared her for this. 3 years ago, sitting on Amara's bed before tucking her in, her mother had said something Amara would never forget. "Baby, some people will judge you before you even speak. They'll make assumptions about who you are, where you belong, what you deserve. That's when you show them who you really are. Not with anger. Not with violence. But with dignity, grace, and unshakable confidence in your own worth." Amara's hand moved instinctively to the seat pocket where her journal rested. She didn't pull it out. She just touched it, feeling its presence there, like a reminder. Like her mother was still with her somehow. The flight attendants began their safety demonstration. Malik and Mason watched with wide eyes, mimicking the movements of putting on oxygen masks. Mrs. Chen double-checked their seatbelts one more time. Amara sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, staring straight ahead. Across the aisle, Linda Hutchinson sat rigid in her seat, her jaw tight, her eyes fixed on the seat back in front of her. The plane began to taxi toward the runway. The captain's voice came over the intercom, smooth and reassuring, welcoming everyone aboard Flight 447 to Los Angeles. The engines hummed to life. And as the plane lifted off the ground, climbing into the cloudless New York sky, none of the passengers could have known what was about to unfold at 30,000 feet. Because sometimes, the worst of humanity reveals itself in the most unexpected places. And sometimes, the most powerful response comes from the smallest voice. What was about to happen on this flight would be talked about for months. It would make headlines. It would spark conversations. And it would all start with one woman's inability to see 3 children as anything other than a problem. But here's what I want you to think about. Have you ever been in a situation where someone judged you before knowing anything about you? Have you ever felt like you didn't belong somewhere, even though you had every right to be there? Drop your stories in the comments below. because what happened next on Flight 447 is something everyone needs to hear. And if you want to see how this 10-year-old girl handled one of the most uncomfortable situations imaginable, you better hit that subscribe button right now, because the next part of this story will leave you speechless. The seatbelt sign turned off with a soft chime. Passengers began pulling out laptops, books, and headphones, settling in for the 6-hour flight. Malik asked Mrs. Chin if he could have his tablet now. Mason was already coloring in a superhero coloring book. Amara pulled out her journal and opened it to a blank page, her favorite pen poised and ready to write. And across the aisle, Linda Hutchinson made a phone call that would set everything in motion. But that's where things get really interesting. 20 minutes into the flight, the seatbelt sign had been off for about 10 minutes. The cabin had settled into that comfortable rhythm of a long flight, the gentle hum of engines, the occasional ding of a call button, the soft murmur of conversations and in-flight entertainment systems. Malik had been playing a racing game on his tablet, completely absorbed, his little fingers swiping across the screen with intense concentration. Mason was still coloring, his tongue poking out slightly as he carefully stayed inside the lines of Captain America's shield. Then it happened. The first spark that would ignite everything. Malik had been holding his tablet up to show Mason something on the screen, leaning across the armrest between their seats. As he pulled back to his own seat, his elbow caught the edge of his tray table. The tablet slipped from his hands. In that split second of panic that only a 7-year-old can feel when their precious device is falling, Malik lunged forward to catch it. His small arm shot out across the aisle, and his hand brushed against Linda Hutchinson's forearm as she was raising a glass of champagne to her lips. The contact was barely noticeable. A graze, really. The kind of accidental touch that happens dozens of times on any crowded airplane. The champagne didn't spill. Linda wasn't hurt. But you would have thought Malik had assaulted her based on her reaction. Her head whipped around so fast you could almost hear her neck crack. Her eyes, cold and sharp, locked onto Malik like a hawk spotting prey. The words came out in a hiss, loud enough for half the first-class cabin to hear. "Can you control your children? Some of us paid good money for these seats." The cabin seemed to hold its breath. Several passengers looked up from their books and screens. Malik froze, his tablet clutched to his chest, his eyes wide with shock. He was 7. He'd made an accident. And this grown woman was glaring at him like he'd committed a crime. Mrs. Chin immediately leaned forward, her voice calm and apologetic. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. It was completely accidental." He didn't mean to, but Linda cut her off with a wave of her hand, her voice dripping with disdain. "I'm sure it was. But perhaps you could teach them some manners. This is first class, not a playground." Mrs. Chen's expression remained polite, but if you looked closely, you could see the tension in her jaw, the slight tightening around her eyes. "Of course. Again, our apologies." She turned to Malik, her voice gentle. "Be more careful, sweetheart, okay?" Malik nodded quickly, shrinking back into his seat, the joy completely drained from his face. He set his tablet down on his tray table and didn't pick it up again. Across the aisle, in seat 1A, Amara had seen everything. She'd been writing in her journal, documenting her thoughts about the trip, about how excited she was to see her father, about the dreams she'd been having about her mother lately. But the moment she heard Linda's sharp voice, her pen had stopped mid-sentence. She looked up, taking in the scene with those observant eyes that missed nothing. She saw Malik's face, flushed with embarrassment. She saw Mrs. Chen's forced smile. And she saw Linda Hutchinson settling back into her seat with a satisfied smirk, as if she'd just put someone in their rightful place. Something stirred in Amara's chest. Not anger, not yet. But something close to it. A protective instinct that had been growing stronger ever since her mother died, ever since she'd become the unofficial third parent to her little brothers. She wanted to say something. Her mouth opened slightly, words forming on her tongue. But then she remembered. She remembered a night 3 years ago, maybe a month before her mother got sick. They'd been at a restaurant, celebrating Amara's 7th birthday. It was a fancy place, the kind with cloth napkins and waiters in bow ties. The hostess had looked at their family with barely concealed surprise when they walked in, had asked if they had a reservation 3 times even though Amara's father had confirmed that morning. They'd been seated at a table in the back, near the kitchen doors, even though Amara had seen plenty of empty tables near the windows. That night, as her mother tucked her into bed, Amara had asked why people looked at them that way sometimes. Why that hostess had seemed so surprised to see them. Her mother had sat on the edge of the bed, had taken Amara's small hands in her own, and had spoken words that Amara could still hear as clearly as if she were in the room right now. Baby, some people will judge you before you even speak. They'll make assumptions about who you are, where you belong, what you deserve, based on nothing but the color of your skin. And that's not fair. That's not right. But it's real. And when it happens, you have two choices. You can let their ignorance make you small, make you doubt yourself, make you angry and bitter. Or you can show them who you really are. Not with anger. Not by stooping to their level. But with dignity, grace, and unshakable confidence in your own worth. You show them that their opinions don't define you. That you know exactly who you are, and their ignorance can't touch that. Amara's mother had brushed a braid away from her face, had smiled that warm smile that Amara missed every single day. You are a Williams. You come from kings and queens, from warriors and scholars, from people who survived things that should have broken them but didn't. You carry that in your blood, in your bones, in your spirit. Don't you ever let anyone make you forget that. Sitting in seat 1A, at 30,000 feet, Amara felt her hand move to the journal in front of her. She gripped it tighter, feeling the worn leather under her fingertips, feeling her mother's presence in that touch. Her jaw set with determination. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, "Show them who you really are." She took a slow breath and went back to writing in her journal. But she was no longer writing about the trip. She was writing about what was happening right now. She was documenting everything, the way she'd learned to do when processing difficult emotions. And she was preparing herself, because something told her this wasn't over. She was right. About 15 minutes passed. The flight attendants came through with the beverage service, taking orders and distributing drinks with practiced efficiency. Mason had finished his coloring page and was getting restless. He pulled out his favorite toy from his backpack, a small red race car that their father had given him for his last birthday. It was die-cast metal, detailed and well-made, and Mason took it everywhere. He was rolling it along the armrest, making quiet engine noises, completely in his own world. And then, as 7-year-olds do when they're focused on play and not on spatial awareness, Mason's hand slipped. The car tumbled from the armrest, bounced once on his seat, and then fell to the floor. It rolled. And because the plane was tilted ever so slightly, nose up in cruising altitude, the car rolled right across the aisle, straight toward Linda Hutchinson's designer shoes. Mason unbuckled his seatbelt immediately and slid out of his seat. "My car," he said softly, dropping to his hands and knees. He crawled across the small distance, reaching for his toy that had come to rest just inches from Linda's foot. His small hand stretched out, almost there. And then Linda Hutchinson deliberately, unmistakably, kicked it away. Not hard. Not violent. But intentional. Her foot moved, her designer shoe connecting with the small metal car, sending it skittering further down the aisle, under the seat in front of her. And then she looked down at Mason, still on his hands and knees, and said in a voice loud enough for anyone nearby to hear, "Keep your things in your own space." Mason's face crumpled. His bottom lip quivered. For a 7-year-old, that toy car wasn't just a toy. It was a connection to his father, a source of comfort, a prized possession. And this woman had just kicked it away like it was trash. His eyes filled with tears that he tried desperately to hold back, because the twins had been taught that big boys don't cry in public. But he was 7, and his heart was breaking. Malik saw his brother's face and something fierce flashed in his eyes. He unbuckled his own seatbelt and moved to Mason's side. That wasn't nice. His voice was louder than he intended, cracking with emotion. "You're mean." He just wanted his car. Mrs. Chen was already moving, reaching for both boys, trying to de-escalate. But before she could say anything, before Linda could respond, Amara was there. She'd unbuckled her seatbelt and crossed to her brothers in 3 quick steps. She knelt down beside them, putting one arm around each twin, and spoke in a voice that was quiet but somehow carried more authority than any adult's. It's okay. We know who we are. She looked at Mason first, wiping a tear from his cheek with her thumb. It's just a car, Mason. We'll get it. It's okay. Then she looked at Malik, her eyes meeting his, steady and calm. And we don't yell at adults, remember? Even when they're wrong. We stay calm. Stay dignified. She said that last word, dignified, while looking directly at Linda Hutchinson, and somehow, coming from a 10-year-old, it felt like the most cutting statement in the world. Amara retrieved the car from under the seat, handed it to Mason, and guided both boys back to their seats. She buckled them in herself, squeezing each of their hands. We're okay, she whispered. We're always okay. Then she returned to her own seat, her posture straight, her expression neutral, and picked up her journal again. But if you'd been sitting close enough, you would have seen that her hands were shaking. Just slightly. Just enough to make her handwriting a bit unsteady as she continued to document everything that was happening. The flight attendant's voice came over the intercom, cheerful and oblivious. Ladies and gentlemen, we're pleased to announce that Wi-Fi is now available for purchase on this flight. You can connect using the Sky High app on your devices. We hope you enjoy staying connected during your journey today. And that's when Linda Hutchinson pulled out her phone. She made no attempt to be discreet. She didn't lower her voice. She held the phone to her ear and spoke loud enough that every passenger in first class could hear every word. The phone rang twice before someone picked up. Jennifer? Hi, it's Linda. You won't believe the flight I'm on right now. No, the flight itself is fine, but you wouldn't believe who they're letting into first class these days. Several passengers' heads turned. A businessman in seat 2C glanced up from his laptop, frowning. A woman across the aisle looked uncomfortable and put her headphones on. But Linda didn't care. She was on a roll. 3 children, Jennifer. 3 of them. And some woman who's probably never flown anything but economy in her life, acting like she belongs here. I paid $1,200 for this seat, and I have to sit across from a daycare center. The kids are running around, touching things, being loud. It's absolutely ridiculous. I don't know what this airline is thinking. Mrs. Chen's jaw tightened so much it looked painful. Her hands gripped the armrests of her seat, knuckles going white. She was a woman of infinite patience. You had to be a nanny, but everyone has their limit. She turned her head slightly, as if considering whether to say something, whether to defend herself and the children she cared for. But before she could make that decision, she felt a small hand on her arm. Amara had reached across from her window seat, her hand resting gently on Mrs. Chen's forearm. When Mrs. Chen looked at her, Amara shook her head almost imperceptibly. Don't engage. Don't give her what she wants. Mrs. Chen understood. She took a deep breath and turned back to face forward, though her jaw remained tight. Amara opened her journal to a fresh page. Her pen moved across the paper with deliberate strokes. She was writing down everything Linda had said, word for word. The date, the time, the flight number, every detail. Her handwriting was neater now, steadier, as if the act of documenting gave her something to focus on, something to control in a situation where she felt powerless. Linda was still talking, her voice carrying throughout the cabin. I know, right? And the airline acts like I'm the problem if I complain. Like I'm being unreasonable for expecting a certain standard when I pay for first class. Jennifer, they're eating chips. Chips? In first class. I suppose that's fine if you're not used to caviar, but really, it's just trashy. That last word, trashy, hung in the air like poison. Several passengers were now actively avoiding eye contact, staring determinately at their screens or out their windows, the way people do when they're witnessing something uncomfortable but don't want to get involved. The businessman in 2C shook his head in disgust, though whether it was at Linda or the situation in general wasn't clear. The flight attendant, Jessica, was approaching with a tray of snacks. She'd heard at least part of Linda's phone conversation. Everyone had, and her professional smile looked strained. As she reached the Williams family's row, she leaned down slightly and asked in a genuinely kind voice, "Can I get you anything? We have pretzels, cookies, mixed nuts, or fruit and cheese plates." Malik, who had been silent since the car incident, quietly asked for pretzels. Mason chose cookies. Amara politely declined. "No thank you, I'm not hungry right now." Mrs. Chen requested a fruit and cheese plate and a ginger ale. Jessica nodded, began to move away, and then paused. She glanced back at Amara, something like sympathy in her eyes, and very quietly said, "I'm sorry about the noise." Then she moved on before Amara could respond. Linda had finally ended her phone call, but she wasn't done. Not even close. As Malik opened his bag of pretzels and the crinkling sound broke the silence, Linda's head whipped around. "Does he have to be so loud with that?" she muttered, but loud enough to be heard. When Malik laughed at something Mason showed him on his tablet a few minutes later, a genuine, delighted 7-year-old laugh, Linda visibly cringed and pressed her call button. Jessica appeared within 30 seconds. "Yes, ma'am, how can I help you?" Linda gestured with her head toward the Williams family, not even looking at them directly, as if they were objects rather than people. "Is there any way you could ask them to keep it down? This is first class. I was hoping for a peaceful flight, and the noise level is really quite excessive." Jessica's expression flickered with something, discomfort, maybe embarrassment, but she maintained her professional demeanor. "I understand them. I'll see what I can do." She crossed the aisle and leaned down to Mrs. Chen, her voice apologetic and quiet. "I'm so sorry to ask this, but we've had a complaint about noise. Would you mind just keeping the volume down a bit?" Mrs. Chen's face was a mask of politeness, but her eyes flashed with barely contained anger. "Of course, though I should mention the children haven't been loud at all. They're being perfectly well behaved." Jessica nodded quickly. I know they are. I'm sorry." And she hurried away, clearly uncomfortable with the entire situation. Malik and Mason exchanged confused looks. They'd been whispering to each other, sharing a tablet game, laughing occasionally. Normal kid behavior. Nothing excessive. Nothing that would bother any reasonable person. Malik's voice was small when he asked, "Are we being too loud?" Mrs. Chen pulled both boys close. "No, sweetheart. You're perfect. You're both perfect." But the message had been received. The boys stopped talking to each other. They turned off the tablet's sound completely. They sat as still and quiet as two 7-year-olds could possibly sit, as if making themselves smaller might make the problem go away. And across the aisle, Linda Hutchinson settled back into her seat with a satisfied smile, picked up her champagne glass, and took a long, deliberate sip. In seat 1A, Amara Williams continued to write. Her pen moved across the page, filling it with neat, controlled handwriting. But if you looked very, very closely, you would see that her hands were shaking. Not a lot. Not obviously. But enough that every few words, a letter would wobble slightly, a line would waver. She was 10 years old. She was watching her brothers be humiliated for no reason other than existing. She was watching a grown woman treat them like they didn't belong, like they were less than, like their presence was somehow offensive. And she was doing exactly what her mother had taught her to do. She was staying calm. She was staying dignified. She was documenting everything. But inside, a storm was building. Inside, she was preparing for something. She didn't know what yet. But she knew this couldn't stand. This couldn't be the end of the story. The minutes ticked by. The plane continued its steady path across the country. But the atmosphere in row 1 of first class was thick with tension, with unspoken words, with injustice that everyone could feel but no one seemed willing to address. And then Linda made one more comment. One more casual cruelty, delivered with the kind of practiced disdain that comes from a lifetime of believing you're better than others. The flight attendant had come by with another round of drinks, and had offered chips to Mrs. Chen, who'd accepted with a polite smile. As Jessica walked away, Linda muttered, just loud enough, "I suppose chips are fine if you're not used to caviar." That was it. That was the moment when something shifted. Because while Mrs. Chen's face remained neutral, while the twins didn't even understand what Linda meant, Amara heard it. Amara understood it. And Amara had had enough. She didn't say anything. Not yet. But her hand moved from her journal to the seat pocket in front of her. She pulled out the safety card, pretending to read it. But what she was actually doing was thinking. Planning. Her mind, sharp and strategic despite her age, was working through options, through consequences, through what her mother would do, through what was right. Have you ever been in a situation where you witnessed someone being treated unfairly, and you had to decide whether to speak up or stay silent? It's one of the hardest decisions we face, especially when confronting someone means making yourself vulnerable, making yourself a target. What would you have done in Amara's position? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because what this 10-year-old girl does next is something most adults wouldn't have the courage to do. And if you're invested in this story, if you want to see how Amara handles the most challenging moment of her young life, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what happens in the next 15 minutes will restore your faith in the power of standing up for what's right, no matter how old you are or how scared you might be. The flight was barely halfway through. 3 more hours to Los Angeles. 3 more hours in this toxic atmosphere, with this woman who seemed determined to make a family miserable for no reason other than prejudice and entitlement. Malik and Mason sat in silence, their joy completely drained. Mrs. Chin stared straight ahead, her hands still gripping the armrests. And Amara Williams, 10 years old, with her mother's journal in her lap and her mother's words in her heart, was making a decision that would change everything. Because sometimes, staying quiet isn't dignified. Sometimes, grace doesn't mean accepting cruelty. Sometimes, the bravest thing a child can do is refuse to be made small. And Amara Williams was about to show everyone on that plane exactly what courage looks like. 2 hours into the flight, somewhere over Ohio, the plane hit turbulence. It started as a gentle bump, the kind experienced flyers barely notice. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and routine. "Folks, we're experiencing some light chop as we pass through a weather system. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. Flight attendants, please be seated." Then the plane dropped. Not dramatically, not dangerously, but enough that stomachs lurched and drinks sloshed in their cups and overhead compartments rattled. The kind of turbulence that makes even seasoned travelers grip their armrests a little tighter. And for a 7-year-old boy who'd been sitting in tense silence for the past hour, who'd been made to feel like his very presence was a problem, who was already on edge, it was terrifying. Mason's hands flew to his armrests. His eyes went wide. And when the plane dropped again, harder this time, a small sound escaped his throat. Then another. And then he was crying. Not screaming, not throwing a tantrum. Just crying the way scared children cry when they can't help it. Tears streaming down his face, small hiccuping sobs, his whole body trembling. Malik immediately reached for his brother's hand, his own face pale with fear but trying to be brave. Mrs. Chen unbuckled her seatbelt despite the instructions and leaned across to comfort Mason, her voice soft and soothing. "It's okay, sweetheart. It's just bumps. The plane is fine. You're safe. I've got you." And that's when Linda Hutchinson's voice cut through the cabin like a knife. "Oh, for God's sake, can someone get these kids under control? Where are their parents? Who's supervising them?" The turbulence had stopped. The plane had steadied. But Mason was still crying, that awful scared crying that breaks your heart if you have any empathy at all. And this woman, this grown adult, was complaining about a frightened child as if he were an inconvenience, as if his fear were somehow an imposition on her flight experience. Something in Amara snapped. Not visibly, not loudly, but inside, something fundamental shifted. She'd been patient. She'd been quiet. She'd absorbed insult after insult, had watched her brothers be diminished and dismissed, had followed her mother's advice about dignity and grace. But there's a limit. There's a point where silence becomes complicity, where grace becomes enabling, where dignity requires speaking up. Amara unbuckled her seatbelt. She stood up. And when she spoke, her voice was calm, clear, and carried throughout the first-class cabin with remarkable authority for someone who was 4.5 feet tall. "Our nanny is supervising us, and we're perfectly behaved." Every head in first class turned. The businessman in 2A looked up from his laptop. The woman across the aisle removed her headphones. Even the flight attendants, strapped into their jump seats, went still. Because there was something about the way this 10-year-old girl spoke, something about the steadiness in her voice, that commanded attention. Linda turned to look at Amara fully for the first time, really look at her, and her expression was a mixture of shock and indignation. When she spoke, her voice dripped with condescension. A nanny? How nice. Let me guess, scholarship kids on their first flight? Probably don't even know what forks to use. The silence that followed was deafening, because everyone in that cabin heard what Linda had really said. Everyone understood the subtext, the assumptions, the ugly prejudice wrapped up in that seemingly casual comment. And everyone was watching to see what would happen next. Amara smoothed down her navy blue dress. It was a small gesture, almost unconscious, but it had the effect of making her look even more composed, even more in control. She stepped into the aisle, standing directly across from Linda's seat, and looked the woman straight in the eye. No fear. No hesitation. Just a 10-year-old girl who knew exactly who she was and refused to be made small. Ma'am, we haven't disturbed anyone. My brothers are 7 years old. They're allowed to be children. My brother was scared during turbulence. That's a normal human reaction. And we have every right to be on this flight, in these seats, just as much as you do. The words were delivered without anger, without raising her voice. But they landed like hammer blows. The businessman in 2A set his laptop aside completely, now fully invested in what was happening. A couple in row 3 were leaning into the aisle to see better. Even the flight attendants had unbuckled and were starting to make their way forward, sensing something significant was unfolding. Linda's face flushed red. She stood up, and suddenly the dynamic shifted, a grown woman towering over a child. When she spoke, her voice was sharp and cutting. Don't you talk back to me. Where I come from, children know their place. You do not address adults that way. You should be teaching these boys respect, not encouraging them to. Amara didn't let her finish. And where I come from, people treat others with basic respect regardless of age or race. My brothers have done nothing wrong. We have done nothing wrong. And your discomfort with our presence is your problem, not ours. The cabin erupted in murmurs. Several passengers were nodding. A woman in row 2 actually said, "Good for you, sweetheart," loud enough to be heard. The businessman in 2A was openly smiling now, shaking his head in appreciation. But Linda was furious. Her hands were shaking, her face was flushed, and she'd lost whatever veneer of civility she'd been maintaining. She turned toward the approaching flight attendant, Jessica, the same one who'd been forced to ask the children to be quieter earlier. Linda's voice was loud, demanding, imperious. "I want them moved. I didn't pay $1,200 for this seat to sit near them." She said, "them," the way other people say curse words. With disgust. With contempt. And everyone heard it. Everyone understood exactly what she meant. Jessica looked trapped. Her eyes darted between Linda and the Williams family, between a demanding passenger and a situation that had spiraled far beyond normal customer service protocols. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say anything, Amara spoke again. "That won't be necessary." She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out her phone. It was a nice phone, new, the kind that costs several $100s. She held it in her small hands with complete steadiness, no trembling, no uncertainty. She looked at Linda directly and said in that same calm, measured voice, "I think I need to make a phone call." Linda actually laughed. It was a harsh, mocking sound that made several passengers visibly uncomfortable. "Oh, this is precious. What are you going to do, little girl? Call your daddy?" She said it in a baby voice, as if talking to a toddler, as if Amara were too stupid to understand she was being mocked. Amara's expression didn't change. If anything, she looked even more composed. "Actually, I think he'd want to know about this." Linda's laughter got louder, more theatrical. She looked around at the other passengers as if inviting them to share in the joke. "Oh, please. And what exactly is your daddy going to do from the ground? Is he going to magically appear and save you? This is pathetic. You're pathetic." Several passengers shifted uncomfortably. The woman in row 2 looked angry on Amara's behalf. The businessman in 2A had stopped smiling and was now watching with intense focus, as if sensing something was about to happen. Amara didn't respond to the insults. Instead, she did something that would be talked about for months afterward. She tapped her phone screen a few times, selected a contact, and as the phone began to ring, she calmly pressed the speaker button. The ringing filled the cabin, loud and clear, broadcast for everyone to hear. It rang once, twice, and then a male voice answered, deep and professional, clearly in the middle of something important. Amara? Baby, is everything okay? You know I'm in the middle of... The voice was warm when addressing his daughter, but you could hear papers rustling, other voices in the background, the sounds of a high-level business meeting being interrupted. And Amara, standing in that airplane aisle with her phone held out in front of her, spoke with the same calm clarity she'd maintained throughout. Dad, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but there's a situation on Flight 447. The background noise on the other end of the line stopped immediately. When the man spoke again, all warmth was gone, replaced by sharp, focused concern. What kind of situation? Are you safe? Are your brothers safe? We're safe, Amara assured him quickly. Nobody's hurt, but a passenger is being unkind to us. To Malik and Mason. She's been making comments throughout the flight. About us not belonging in first class. About Mrs. Chin. She kicked Mason's toy away when he tried to pick it up. She complained when Malik laughed. And just now, she called us scholarship kids and said we probably don't know what forks to use. The silence on the other end of the line lasted exactly 3 seconds. But in those 3 seconds, you could feel the temperature drop. When David Williams spoke again, his voice was cold, controlled, and absolutely terrifying in its calm. Put the flight attendant on the phone. Now. Jessica, who had been standing frozen throughout this entire exchange, suddenly realized everyone was looking at her. Amara held out the phone, and Jessica took it with shaking hands. You could see the confusion on her face, see her trying to figure out why this man wanted to talk to her, trying to understand what was happening. She held the phone to her ear, her voice professional but uncertain. Hello? This is Jessica Martin, senior flight attendant. How can I? And then she went completely still. The color drained from her face so fast it was like watching a magic trick. Her eyes went wide. Her hand not holding the phone flew to her mouth. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper, trembling with shock. Mr. Williams? Sir, I didn't realize. Oh my God, I'm so sorry, I didn't know these were your... From the phone speaker, loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear, came that same controlled, cold voice. What is your employee number, Ms. Martin? I what? Sir, your employee number. Now. Jessica rattled off a string of numbers, her voice shaking. By now, the other 2 flight attendants in the first-class cabin had made their way to the scene. They stood a few feet away, trying to figure out what was happening, exchanging confused and increasingly worried looks. One of them, an older man with graying hair, leaned close to his colleague and whispered something. The colleague's eyes went wide, and she mouthed a single word, Williams? David Williams was still talking. I want you to document everything that's happened on this flight. Every comment. Every interaction. I want statements from any passengers who witnessed this behavior. And I want the name and seat number of the passenger who has been harassing my children. Jessica was nodding frantically, even though he couldn't see her. Yes, sir. Yes, of course, sir. Right away, sir. I'm going to make some calls. In approximately 5 minutes, you're going to receive instructions from flight operations. You will follow those instructions exactly. Do you understand? Yes, sir. Absolutely, sir. Put my daughter back on. Jessica handed the phone back to Amara like it was made of glass, like she was afraid it might explode. Amara took it calmly, turned off the speaker, and held it to her ear. Her voice softened immediately. I'm here, Dad. What David Williams said to his daughter in the next 30 seconds, no one else could hear. But they could see Amara's face. They could see the way her shoulders relaxed slightly, the way her eyes got a little misty, the way she nodded and said, I know, and I love you too, and I will. When she ended the call and slipped the phone back into her pocket, she looked at her brothers, gave them a small smile that said everything's going to be okay, and then returned to her seat. The cabin was completely silent. No one was watching movies. No one was reading. Every passenger in first class was staring at the Williams family or at Linda Hutchinson or at the flight attendants huddled together in a panicked conference. Because slowly, like watching dominoes fall, people were starting to understand what had just happened. The flight attendants knew immediately. You could see it in their faces, in the way they kept glancing at the Williams children with horror and sympathy. The businessman in 2A was pulling out his phone, likely Googling David Williams Sky High Airlines, based on the way his eyebrows rose higher and higher as he read. The woman in row 2 had her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with dawning realization. But Linda? Linda was still smirking. Still oblivious. She'd heard the phone call, had heard the flight attendant's reaction, but she'd completely missed the significance. She was settling back into her seat, picking up her champagne glass, shaking her head like she'd just witnessed something mildly amusing. She muttered, just loud enough to be heard, "The drama. Absolutely ridiculous. As if making a phone call will change anything." The flight attendants heard her. Their faces went even paler. The older male attendant actually took a step toward her, opened his mouth as if to warn her, and then apparently thought better of it and stepped back. Because what was about to happen didn't need any warning. What was about to happen was already in motion. One of the flight attendants pulled out the airplane phone mounted near the galley and dialed a number. You could hear her speaking rapidly, urgently. "Yes, this is Flight 447. Yes, I know. They're here. She's in one. Yes, ma'am, I understand. Right away." She hung up and turned to her colleagues, her face grim. "We're returning to the gate." The words hung in the air like a bomb. Several passengers gasped. Linda finally looked up, confused. "What? Why would we return to the gate? We're 2 hours into the flight." No one answered her. The flight attendants avoided her gaze and hurried toward the cockpit. Within 60 seconds, the captain's voice came over the intercom, professional but with an undercurrent of tension that experienced flyers would recognize immediately. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've received instructions from flight operations to return to JFK Airport. We'll be landing in approximately 40 minutes. We apologize for the inconvenience. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for our return." The cabin erupted in confused murmurs. Passengers were pulling out phones, checking for emergency alerts, asking each other what was happening. A man in row 4 called out, "Is there a mechanical issue? Is the plane safe?" The captain's voice returned, "The aircraft is completely safe. This is an operational decision." Linda was looking around, still not understanding. "This is absurd. We're going back because of a phone call from some..." But she didn't finish that sentence. Because the businessman in 2A, who had been scrolling through his phone, looked up and said in a voice loud enough for half the cabin to hear, "You just harassed the children of David Williams." Linda stared at him blankly. "Who?" The man turned his phone around, showing her the screen. "David Williams, CEO and majority shareholder of Sky High Airlines. The man who owns this plane. This entire airline. The man whose children you've been tormenting for the past 2 hours." You could actually see the moment it hit her. The way her face changed. The way her mouth opened in a little "oh" of shock. The way her eyes darted to the Williams family and then to the flight attendants and then back to the phone screen the businessman was holding up. The way her hand, holding the champagne glass, started to shake so badly that liquid sloshed over the rim. That's not possible. They're just... I didn't." But her voice trailed off because she could see it in everyone's faces. She could see it in the way the flight attendants were giving her a wide berth, in the way other passengers were looking at her with a mixture of shock and satisfaction, in the way Amara Williams was sitting calmly in her seat, journal open, writing everything down with the quiet confidence of someone who knows exactly how this story ends. The smirk was gone. The condescension was gone. And in its place was slowly dawning horror as Linda Hutchinson began to realize what she'd done. Who she'd done it to. And what was about to happen when they landed. In seat 1A, Amara reached across and took both her brother's hands. Malik on one side, Mason on the other. She squeezed gently and said, just loud enough for them to hear, "See? What? We're always okay." Mrs. Chen was crying quietly, tears of relief and vindication running down her face. She reached over and squeezed Amara's shoulder, unable to find words big enough for what this child had just done. And as the plane began its turn, banking back toward New York, back toward a reckoning that Linda Hutchinson could never have imagined, One question echoed through that cabin: how could anyone be so cruel to children and think there wouldn't be consequences? Have you ever seen someone who thought they were untouchable suddenly realize they're not? That moment when privilege and prejudice collide with consequences? What do you think is going through Linda's mind right now? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to see exactly what happens when this plane lands, when Linda comes face to face with the reality of what she's done, you need to subscribe right now. Because what happens in the next segment is the most satisfying moment of justice you'll see all year. The plane is turning around. The authorities are being notified. And Linda Hutchinson's world is about to come crashing down. 40 minutes to landing. 40 minutes of the most uncomfortable silence Linda Hutchinson would ever experience. 40 minutes of knowing that with every mile closer to JFK, she was flying toward the end of something. And it was all because she couldn't see 3 children as human beings worthy of respect. Sometimes, karma doesn't wait. Sometimes, justice is swift. And sometimes, it comes delivered by a 10-year-old girl with her mother's journal and her father's phone number. The 40-minute flight back to JFK felt like 40 hours. The cabin was thick with tension, with anticipation, with the electric feeling that comes when everyone knows something significant is about to happen but no one knows exactly what. Passengers whispered to each other, theories flying back and forth. The flight attendants moved through the cabin with tight smiles, offering beverages no one wanted, avoiding eye contact with Linda Hutchinson like she was radioactive. And Linda herself sat rigid in seat 1E, her face cycling through emotions like a slot machine: confusion, anger, fear, defiance, and back to confusion. She'd Googled David Williams on her phone. She'd seen the articles, the Forbes profiles, the photos of him at industry conferences and charity galas. She'd read that he owned 63% of Sky High Airlines, that he'd built a transportation empire worth billions, that he was known in business circles as brilliant, strategic, and absolutely ruthless when protecting his interests. But she kept shaking her head, as if she could deny reality through sheer force of will. She'd convinced herself there must be some mistake, some misunderstanding. Because the alternative, that she'd spent 2 hours systematically harassing the children of one of the most powerful men in the airline industry, was too horrifying to accept. The plane descended through cloud cover, the New York skyline coming into view through the windows. The landing was smooth, professional, and the captain taxied to a gate with practiced efficiency. But this wasn't the gate they departed from. This was gate A7, isolated at the end of the terminal, the kind of gate usually reserved for international flights or special circumstances. The kind of gate where things could be handled discreetly. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and passengers immediately began reaching for their bags, grumbling about the delay, checking their phones for rebooking options. But the captain's voice stopped the mid-movement. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We have some operational matters to attend to before we can begin the deplaning process. This will only take a few minutes. Thank you for your patience." Linda stood up anyway, reaching for her bag in the overhead compartment. "This is ridiculous," she announced to no one in particular. "I have a connecting flight to make. This is completely unacceptable." One of the flight attendants, the older male one, approached her quickly. "Ma'am, you need to remain seated until—" "I don't need to do anything," Linda snapped. "I've been more than patient with this absurd situation. Those children have disrupted this entire flight, and now we're all suffering because of their—" She never finished that sentence. Because the forward cabin door opened with a pneumatic hiss, and the first person to board wasn't a gate agent or a cleaning crew. It was a woman in her 50s wearing a perfectly tailored suit, carrying a tablet, with an expression that could freeze water. Behind her were 3 more airline staff members, all in crisp uniforms with golden wings on their lapels. Management. High-level management. The kind of people who don't show up unless something serious has happened. The woman in the suit, her name tag read, Margaret Torres, Director of Flight Operations, stepped into the cabin and her eyes immediately found Linda Hutchinson, still standing in the aisle with her hand on her carry-on bag. Margaret's expression didn't change, but there was something in her eyes, something cold and final, like a judge about to deliver a sentence. Linda's face lit up with vindication. She actually smiled. Finally! Someone in charge. I want to lodge a formal complaint. These children have been. Margaret held up one hand, silencing her with a gesture so commanding that Linda's mouth snapped shut mid-word. When Margaret spoke, her voice carried throughout the cabin, professional but with an edge sharp enough to cut glass. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to gather your belongings. The cabin went absolutely silent. Every passenger stopped what they were doing. Every head turned toward the front. Because those words, delivered in that tone, meant something. Everyone could feel it. Linda blinked, confused. What? I was just getting my bag. Now if you'll listen to my complaint about these children. Ma'am. Margaret's voice didn't rise, but somehow it got harder. I need you to gather all of your belongings and prepare to exit the aircraft. Immediately. Linda's smile faltered. Excuse me? I'm not the problem here. These children and their nanny, they've been disruptive this entire flight. They don't belong in first class. I paid good money for my seat, and I've had to endure. Margaret took 2 steps closer, and her face was like stone. Ma'am, you've been harassing the children of David Williams. The name dropped into the cabin like a grenade. Several passengers gasped. The businessman in 2A leaned forward, not wanting to miss a single word. Malik and Mason, sitting quietly beside their sister, looked at each other with wide eyes. Mrs. Chen's hand found Amara's shoulder, squeezing gently. Linda's face went through a complicated series of expressions: confusion, recognition, fear, and then, incredibly, defiance. So? I don't care who their father is. That doesn't give them the right to. Margaret's voice cut through like a razor. David Williams, CEO and majority shareholder of Sky High Airlines. The man who owns this aircraft, this airline, this terminal, and who has personally requested your immediate removal and issued a lifetime ban from all Sky High properties, including all partner airlines in our network. You could have heard a pin drop in that cabin. Actually, you probably could have heard a pin drop in the next terminal over. The silence was that complete, that absolute. Every single person was staring at Linda Hutchinson, watching her face as the words penetrated, as the reality of her situation finally began to sink in. The color drained from Linda's face so completely she looked like she might faint. Her hands, still gripping her designer handbag, began to shake. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. When she finally found her voice, it came out as barely a whisper. You can't. I didn't know. Didn't know what? Margaret's voice was colder than ice. Didn't know you were harassing children? Didn't know that treating people with cruelty and prejudice might have consequences? Didn't know that every word you said, every action you took, was being witnessed by dozens of passengers and recorded by cabin cameras? Linda's legs seemed to give out. She sat down hard in her seat, her face now white as paper. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to clutch them together in her lap. I didn't mean, it was just, they were being loud and I. From seat 1A, Amara Williams spoke. Her voice was quiet, but in that silent cabin, every word carried with crystal clarity. She didn't stand up. She didn't turn around. She just spoke, looking straight ahead, with that same calm, measured tone she'd maintained throughout. You were just being yourself. That's the problem. The words hit like a physical blow. Linda's head snapped around, her eyes finding Amara's profile. The 10-year-old girl who'd stood up to her, who'd called her father, who'd set all of this in motion. And on Amara's face was no anger, no triumph, no cruelty. Just a kind of sad certainty, the expression of someone who's seen this before, who understands exactly what happened and why. Linda's defiance crumbled completely. Tears began streaming down her face, taking her carefully applied makeup with them. Her voice came out in a desperate rush. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't know who you were. I didn't mean, if I'd known your father owned the airline, I never would have. She trailed off, apparently realizing mid-sentence how that sounded. That she was apologizing not for her behavior, but for targeting the wrong children. That she was sorry for the consequences, not the actions. And everyone in that cabin heard it, understood what she'd really just admitted. Margaret Torres heard it too, and her expression somehow got even colder. Ma'am, we have a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination and harassment aboard our aircraft. You targeted 3 children and their caregiver with racist microaggressions, verbal abuse, and deliberately hostile behavior. You created an unsafe and hostile environment for passengers under our care. The fact that they happen to be the CEO's children is irrelevant. This behavior would be unacceptable regardless of who they were. She gestured toward the door, where 2 security personnel in dark uniforms had appeared. They were large, professional, and looked like they dealt with difficult situations for a living. You need to leave. Now. Linda tried one more time, her voice breaking with panic. Please. I'm sorry. I'll apologize to them. I'll do whatever you want. I have a connecting flight. I have meetings in Los Angeles. Please, you can't do this. Margaret's face showed no sympathy, no wavering. We can and we are. You have 2 choices. You can gather your belongings and exit the aircraft voluntarily with security escort, or security will remove you by force and you'll be arrested for refusing to comply with crew instructions. What's it going to be? For a moment, it looked like Linda might actually refuse, might actually force them to drag her off. Her face went through one more cycle of emotions, anger, humiliation, desperation. But then she looked around the cabin, saw every single passenger staring at her with expressions ranging from satisfaction to disgust, saw the security officers waiting with infinite patience, saw the Williams family sitting quietly together, dignified and unmoved. She stood on shaking legs and reached for her carry-on with trembling hands. She could barely get it down from the overhead compartment. One of the security officers stepped forward to help, and she flinched away from him like his touch might burn her. As she moved toward the aisle, clutching her bag and her purse, walking the longest walk of her life toward that open aircraft door, something incredible happened. It started with the businessman in 2A. He put his hands together and began to clap. Slow, deliberate, each clap echoing through the silent cabin. Then the woman in row 2 joined him. Then someone in row 3. Then someone else. Within seconds, nearly every passenger in first class was clapping. Not loud, not raucous, but measured and deliberate. The sound of justice being served. The sound of people who'd witnessed cruelty and were satisfied to see consequences. Linda's face flushed red, then white, then red again. She walked faster, her designer heels clicking against the aircraft floor, her whole body radiating humiliation and defeat. As she passed the Williams family's row, she couldn't help herself. She turned, shooting one last venomous look at Amara, at this 10-year-old child who'd somehow orchestrated her complete destruction. And Amara Williams, with both her brothers tucked safely beside her, with Mrs. Chen's protective hand on her shoulder, with her mother's journal resting in her lap, looked up at Linda Hutchinson and did something that was somehow more devastating than anything else she could have done. She smiled. A small, gentle smile. And she lifted one hand in a tiny wave. Goodbye. Linda's face crumpled completely. Whatever venom she'd been holding on to evaporated, leaving only the devastating realization of what she'd done, who she'd done it to, and what it was going to cost her. She turned away and practically ran the last few steps to the door, disappearing into the jetway with the security officers flanking her like an escort of shame. Margaret Torres watched her go, then turned back to the cabin. Her stern expression softened slightly as she approached the Williams family. She crouched down in the aisle so she was at eye level with Amara, and when she spoke, her voice was gentle. I am so deeply sorry for what you and your brothers experienced today. This behavior is absolutely unacceptable, and it should have been stopped much sooner. Her eyes flicked briefly to the flight attendants, who all looked like they wanted to sink through the floor. Your father has asked me to ensure you're comfortable for the rest of your journey. We're preparing another aircraft for you, in our private fleet, that will take you directly to Los Angeles. It'll be ready in about 30 minutes. Amara nodded, her composure finally cracking just slightly. Her eyes were misty, her voice smaller than it had been. Thank you. But we don't need a private plane. We just wanted to be treated with respect. Margaret's eyes softened even more. I know, sweetheart. And you deserved that from the moment you boarded. You handled the situation with more grace and maturity than most adults I know. She paused, then added quietly, Your mother would be very proud." Amara's eyes filled with tears at that, and she nodded, unable to speak. Malik and Mason, who'd been silent throughout this entire ordeal, both wrapped their arms around their big sister. Mrs. Chen was openly crying now, tears of relief and pride streaming down her face. Margaret stood and addressed the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We're going to begin the deplaning process momentarily. For those continuing on to Los Angeles, we'll be making arrangements for your travel. For those who witnessed the incident we just addressed, please see me or any of the flight staff if you'd like to provide a statement. We take these matters very seriously, and your testimony will be part of our official investigation." As passengers began gathering their belongings, several made their way to the Williams family. The businessman from 2A stopped at their row, business card in hand. "Young lady, you showed remarkable courage today. If you ever need anything at all, you call me." He handed the card to Amara, then shook her hand like she was a fellow executive, not a 10-year-old child. The woman from row 2 hugged Mrs. Chen, whispering something about how beautifully she'd raised these children, even though Mrs. Chen tearfully explained she was just the nanny. Other passengers stopped to offer words of support, to tell Amara she did the right thing, to express their disgust at what they'd witnessed. One older woman, probably in her 70s, stopped and looked at Amara with eyes that had seen decades of similar injustices. "Baby girl, I marched in the 60s. I sat at lunch counters and got arrested for the right to be treated like a human being. And what you did today, that's the same fight. Different generation, same courage. Don't you ever let anyone make you small." Amara nodded, overwhelmed by the support, by the validation, by the sudden realization that she'd done something significant. Something that mattered beyond just this one flight. As the cabin slowly emptied, the flight attendants approached hesitantly. Jessica, the senior attendant who'd been forced to ask them to be quiet earlier, was crying. "I'm so sorry," she managed through her tears. "I should have done something sooner. I should have stood up for you. I was scared of getting a complaint, of getting in trouble, and I let that woman make you feel like you didn't belong. I'm so sorry." Amara looked at her for a long moment, then spoke with wisdom far beyond her years. "You did act. Eventually. You took my dad's call. You documented what happened. That's what matters." But there was something in her voice, something that made it clear she'd learned a hard lesson today about how many people will watch injustice happen and say nothing because it's easier, because it's safer, because standing up means making yourself vulnerable. The cabin was nearly empty now. Just the Williams family, a few flight attendants, and Margaret Torres, who was typing rapidly on her tablet, already documenting everything for the investigation. The jetway door was still open, and through it came the sounds of the terminal, announcements, rolling luggage, the normal chaos of an airport. But in this cabin, there was a strange stillness. The aftermath of something significant. The moment after a storm when everything is quiet but you can still feel the electricity in the air. Amara pulled out her journal one more time. She opened it to the pages she'd filled during the flight, reading over her careful documentation of every insult, every microaggression, every moment of cruelty. Then she turned to a fresh page and wrote in her neat, precise handwriting. "Today I learned that standing up for yourself isn't about being loud or angry. It's about knowing your worth and refusing to accept anything less than respect. I learned that silence can be complicity, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to be made small. Mom always said dignity and grace would be my greatest weapons. Today, I finally understood what she meant." She closed the journal, held it close to her chest, and felt more connected to her mother than she had in the 3 years since losing her. Because she'd done exactly what her mother taught her to do. She'd faced cruelty with grace, injustice with dignity, and prejudice with unshakable confidence in her own worth. And she'd won. Have you ever had to choose between staying quiet to keep the peace or speaking up and risking conflict? It's one of the hardest choices we face, especially when the system seems designed to protect the aggressor rather than the victim. What would you have done in Amara's position? Would you have called your parent, or handled it differently? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to see the beautiful resolution to this story, if you want to hear what happens when Amara finally reunites with her father, if you want to know what long-term consequences Linda faced, then subscribe right now. Because the next part of this story will restore your faith in the idea that sometimes justice isn't just an abstract concept. It's real, it's swift, and it's deeply, profoundly satisfying. The Williams family gathered their belongings slowly, with no rush now, no pressure. Malik and Mason were animated again, the trauma of the flight already beginning to fade in the resilient way of children. They chattered about the private plane they'd apparently be taking, about whether it would have video games, about whether they could visit the cockpit. But Amara was quiet, processing, understanding on some deep level that what happened today would shape her for the rest of her life. That she'd faced something ugly and hadn't broken. That she'd protected her brothers and herself using nothing but her voice, her knowledge of who she was, and her father's phone number. That sometimes, being powerful isn't about being the loudest or the strongest. Sometimes, it's about being the calmest person in the room, the one who knows exactly who they are and won't be moved from that truth no matter what anyone else says. Margaret Torres escorted them personally off the aircraft, through a private corridor that bypassed the main terminal, toward the VIP lounge where their father would be waiting. As they walked, Amara thought about Linda Hutchinson, probably being processed by airport security right now, probably calling lawyers, probably trying to figure out how her life had just imploded because she couldn't see 3 children as human beings worthy of respect. And Amara felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction. Not quite. But something like peace. The peace that comes from knowing you did the right thing, even when it was hard. Even when it would have been easier to stay quiet, to stay small, to just endure. The door to the VIP lounge opened ahead of them. And beyond it, Amara could see her father rising from his seat, his face a mixture of concern and pride and love. In just a few moments, she'd be in his arms, safe and protected. But she'd carry something new with her, the knowledge that she could protect herself too. That she'd inherited her mother's grace and her father's strength, and together, those things made her capable of more than she'd ever imagined. The story wasn't over. But this chapter was. And it ended not with a child who'd been victimized, but with a child who'd stood her ground and won. And that made all the difference. After Linda Hutchinson's escort off the aircraft, the cabin felt different. Lighter somehow. Like a oppressive weight had been lifted and everyone could finally breathe properly again. Margaret Torres remained on the plane, coordinating with her staff, speaking quietly into her phone, making arrangements that the Williams family could only partially hear. She approached their row once more, her tablet tucked under her arm, her expression softer than it had been when dealing with Linda. She crouched down again, making herself level with the children, and spoke directly to Amara. On behalf of Sky High Airlines, I want to offer you and your family our most sincere apologies. What happened today should never have occurred. We're offering you full compensation for your tickets, complimentary first-class travel for a year, and any upgrades or accommodations you might need for the remainder of your journey. She continued, listing benefits and offers, her voice professional but genuinely apologetic. Free lounge access. Priority boarding for life. Meal vouchers. Hotel accommodations if they wanted to delay their travel. The list went on, each offer more generous than the last, the airline clearly desperate to make amends for the trauma their CEO's children had experienced under their care. But Amara, sitting with her brothers on either side and Mrs. Chen's protective presence behind her, shook her head gently. When she spoke, her voice was tired but clear. We don't need anything extra. We just wanted to be treated with respect. The simplicity of that statement, the profound truth of it, seemed to hit Margaret harder than any angry demand could have. Her eyes glistened slightly, and she nodded, understanding that no amount of compensation could truly address what had happened. That this 10-year-old girl wasn't asking for special treatment or luxury upgrades. She was asking for the basic human dignity that should have been afforded to her from the moment she stepped on that plane. Margaret stood, composing herself professionally, and smiled. Your father is very proud of how you handled this situation. He asked me to personally tell you that he loves you very much, and that he'll see you in Los Angeles. He's making arrangements to meet you at the gate himself. Amara's face brightened at that. Despite her composure, Despite the maturity she'd displayed throughout this ordeal, she was still a 10-year-old girl who wanted her father. Who needed that reassurance, that protection, that presence. She nodded, blinking back tears, and managed a small, "thank you." As Margaret moved away to coordinate with the remaining staff, something remarkable began to happen. Passengers who hadn't deplaned yet, who'd been hanging back to see what would happen, started approaching the Williams family. Not to gawk or to ask questions, but to offer support, to express their admiration, to acknowledge what they'd witnessed. The businessman from 2A, who'd been one of the first to clap during Linda's departure, approached with his carry-on in hand. He was probably in his 50s, with silver-threaded hair and the kind of confident bearing that comes from years in executive positions. He stopped at their row and addressed Amara directly, speaking to her as an equal rather than talking down to a child. "Young lady, I've been in business for 30 years. I've sat in boardrooms with CEOs and presidents and some of the most powerful people in the world. And I have never, ever seen anyone handle a difficult situation with more grace and maturity than you showed today. Your parents raised you exceptionally well." Amara's eyes immediately misted over. Her composure, which had held firm through harassment and confrontation and even victory, finally began to crack. Her voice came out smaller, more vulnerable than it had been all day. "My mom did. She's not here anymore, but I think she'd be proud." The businessman's expression shifted to one of deep understanding and respect. He reached out, shook Amara's hand formally, and said with complete sincerity, "She would be incredibly proud, young lady. I'm certain of it." As he walked away, Mrs. Chen wrapped both arms around Amara from behind, pulling her into a fierce hug. The nanny's voice was thick with emotion, tears streaming freely down her face. "She would be so proud, sweetheart. So proud. And I'm proud. And your father is proud. You were magnificent." Amara let herself sink into that embrace, let herself be a child for a moment instead of the protector and defender she'd had to be. Malik and Mason, sensing their sister's emotion, climbed over armrests to join the hug, all three children and their nanny wrapped together in a moment of relief and release and love. Other passengers continued to approach. The woman from row 2, who'd been one of the first to clap, squeezed Amara's shoulder and said she had daughters at home and she hoped they'd grow up to be as brave. A middle-aged couple thanked her for standing up, for not staying silent, for showing everyone what courage looked like. A young man, probably in his 20s, told her she'd inspired him to speak up more when he witnessed injustice instead of staying quiet to avoid conflict. The flight attendants began preparing the cabin for the continuing journey to Los Angeles. Those passengers who had Los Angeles as their destination would remain on the aircraft. A new crew was being brought in. The original crew would be suspended pending investigation into why they hadn't intervened sooner. Fresh meals were being loaded. And seat 1E, Linda Hutchinson's former seat, sat empty. Until about 10 minutes later, when a new passenger boarded. She was an elderly black woman, probably in her late 70s, with silver hair styled in elegant twists and the kind of dignified bearing that comes from a lifetime of holding your head high in the face of adversity. She wore a simple but well-made dress, carried a worn leather purse, and moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had aged but whose spirit remained unbreakable. She made her way to seat 1E, stowing her small carry-on with practiced efficiency. As she settled in, she turned to the Williams family across the aisle and smiled warmly. When she spoke, her voice had the melodic quality of someone from the South, each word measured and intentional. "I heard what happened on this flight. The whole airport is talking about it." She looked directly at Amara. "You're a brave girl. Braver than you probably even know." Amara, still emotionally raw from everything that had happened, managed a small smile. "Thank you, ma'am." The woman extended her hand across the aisle. "My name is Dorothy Freeman. And I want you to know that what you did today? That's part of a very long, very important fight." Mrs. Chen, always protective but sensing this was someone special, made introductions. "This is Amara, and these are her brothers, Malik and Mason. I'm Mrs. Chen, their nanny." Dorothy shook each of their hands in turn, including the twins, treating them with the same respect and gravity she'd shown Amara. And then she said something that made everyone in that row go still. I was part of the Freedom Riders in 1961. I sat at lunch counters in Alabama when doing so meant having food thrown at you, being spat on, being dragged out by police. I marched in Selma. I spent a night in jail for the crime of trying to register black folks to vote. Malik and Mason's eyes went wide. They'd learned about the civil rights movement in school, had seen pictures in textbooks and videos on classroom tablets. But here was someone who'd lived it, who'd been there, who carried that history in her body and her memory. Dorothy continued, her voice growing softer but somehow more powerful. And what that woman did to you today? That's the same fight, baby girl. Different generation, different circumstances, but the same ugly root. Prejudice. The belief that some people are better than others based on nothing but the color of their skin. She leaned forward slightly, speaking directly to Amara now, her words carrying the weight of decades of experience. But here's what I want you to understand. What we did in the 60s, the marching and the sitting in and the boycotting, that wasn't about changing the minds of people like that woman. People who are determined to hate will find reasons to. What we were doing was changing the systems that protected them, that allowed them to act on that hate without consequences. Amara pulled out her journal, opened it to a fresh page, and began taking notes. Dorothy noticed and smiled approvingly. That woman thought she could treat you however she wanted because she believed the system would protect her. She believed her privilege, her money, her whiteness, her status, meant she was untouchable. And for most of history, she would have been right. But today, you used the tools available to you. You documented what happened. You stayed calm and dignified. You called someone who had the power to change the situation. And you got justice. That's not revenge. That's accountability. The twins were hanging on every word, fascinated. Mason asked in his small voice, "Were you scared? When you did those things?" Dorothy's face softened as she looked at the 7-year-old. Terrified, sweetheart. Every single time. But being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you're scared and you do the right thing anyway. For the next 30 minutes, as the plane prepared for takeoff on its second attempt to reach Los Angeles, Dorothy Freeman shared stories. About sitting at a Woolworth's lunch counter while an angry mob gathered behind her. About the Freedom Ride bus that was firebombed in Anniston, Alabama. About singing freedom songs in jail cells. About watching friends get beaten by police. About the crushing weight of hatred and the sustaining power of community and purpose. She told them about meeting Dr. King, about hearing him speak about the moral arc of the universe bending toward justice. About the moment the Civil Rights Act passed, and how she'd cried tears of joy and relief and exhaustion. About the decades since, watching progress happen in fits and starts, watching some things get better while others stayed stubbornly the same. The fight isn't over, Dorothy said, her eyes moving from Amara to the twins and back. Every generation has to take up the work. And today, you three learned something important. You learned that your voice matters. That standing up for yourself and each other is not just your right, it's your responsibility. Amara was writing furiously, filling page after page of her journal. Not just with Dorothy's words, but with her own reflections, her own processing of what had happened and what it meant. Mrs. Chen sat quietly, tears streaming down her face again, humbled to be in the presence of someone who'd literally changed history. The plane began its taxi toward the runway, and this time, the mood in the cabin was completely different. There was no tension, no hostility, no undercurrent of prejudice. The new flight crew was attentive and kind, especially to the Williams family. The captain herself came back to introduce herself and promise a smooth flight. And when the plane lifted off, climbing into the sky for the second time that day, Malik and Mason pressed their faces to the window like they'd wanted to do hours ago, exclaiming over the clouds and the view and the way New York City sprawled below them. This time, no one complained about their excitement. No one told them to be quiet. They got to be children, the way they should have been allowed to be from the very beginning. The flight to Los Angeles was smooth and uneventful in the best possible way. Dorothy continued sharing stories, answering the twins' endless questions with patience and warmth. She told them about the March on Washington, about the power of nonviolent resistance, about the importance of education and community and never accepting injustice as inevitable. And Amara absorbed every word, recognizing that she'd been given an incredible gift. Not just the resolution of what happened with Linda Hutchinson, but this conversation, this connection to history, this understanding that she was part of something much larger than one incident on one airplane. As they began their descent into Los Angeles, the captain's voice came over the intercom, warm and personal in a way that was clearly directed at specific passengers. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final approach into Los Angeles International Airport. Weather is clear, temperature is 72 degrees, and we should be at the gate in about 15 minutes. I'd like to extend a special welcome to the Williams family. Your father is waiting at the gate, and on behalf of the entire Sky High Airlines family, we're honored to have you aboard. The cabin erupted in applause. Spontaneous, genuine from passengers who'd either witnessed what happened or heard about it during the stop in New York. Amara's face flushed, embarrassed by the attention but also deeply moved. Malik and Mason grinned and waved like celebrities, their childish joy fully restored. The landing was smooth, professional, perfect. As the plane taxied to the gate, the flight attendants began preparing for deplaning, but several of them kept glancing toward the Williams family with expressions of respect and admiration. The new senior flight attendant, a woman named Carmen, approached their row as the seatbelt sign dinged off. The captain would like to invite you to deplane first, if that's all right. Your father is waiting just outside the jetway. But before they could gather their things, Jessica appeared. The original flight attendant, who'd been suspended pending investigation but had apparently been allowed to see this through. Her eyes were red, her face blotchy from crying. She approached Amara's seat and knelt down, her voice shaking. I need to say this. I should have acted sooner. From the first comment that woman made, I should have shut it down. But I was scared of getting a complaint, scared of being accused of being overly sensitive or causing problems. I chose the path of least resistance instead of doing what was right. And because of that, you and your brothers suffered. You deserved better. You deserved protection from the moment you stepped on this plane, and I failed you. She was crying openly now, not trying to hide it. Watching you stand up for yourself, watching a 10-year-old child show more courage than I did as a grown adult with authority, it's changed me. I don't know if I'll still have a job after today, but if I do, I promise I'll be better. I'll do better. Because of you. Amara looked at her for a long moment, this adult who was apologizing to a child, who was acknowledging her failure and asking for, what? Forgiveness? Understanding? Amara thought about her mother, about what she would say in this moment. You did act. Eventually. You took my dad's call. You documented what happened. That's what matters. We can't change what happened, but we can learn from it. The grace in those words, the maturity, the willingness to see the complexity of the situation rather than just condemning Jessica outright, made the flight attendant cry harder. She squeezed Amara's hand, whispered, "Thank you," and stepped back to let the family gather their belongings. Dorothy Freeman stood with them, and they deplaned together. The Williams family, their new friend who'd lived through history, and Mrs. Chin, who'd held them all together through everything. As they walked up the jetway, crew members lined the walls, standing at attention almost, nodding respectfully as the family passed. And then they emerged into the gate area, and there he was. David Williams was impossible to miss. He was tall, probably 6'3", with broad shoulders and the kind of commanding presence that made people instinctively move out of his way. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, the jacket open to show a crisp white shirt, no tie. His skin was the same warm brown as his children's, his hair cut close and just beginning to show silver at the temples. He was handsome, distinguished, powerful, exactly what you'd expect a billionaire CEO to look like. But the moment he saw his children, all of that corporate authority melted away. His face crumpled. His eyes filled with tears. And he dropped to his knees right there in the gate area, opening his arms wide. "Daddy!" Malik and Mason shrieked in unison, breaking away from Mrs. Chin and running full speed toward their father. They crashed into him with the full force of 7-year-old enthusiasm, and he caught them, wrapped them in his arms, buried his face in their small shoulders. Amara walked more slowly, her composure finally fully breaking. Tears streamed down her face as she approached her father, and when she reached him, he extended one arm to pull her into the embrace, holding all three of his children like they were the most precious things in the universe. Which to him they were. They stayed like that for a long moment, this family reunited, this father assuring himself that his children were safe and whole. When David finally pulled back, he kept his hands on Amara's shoulders and looked directly into her eyes. His face was wet with tears he wasn't trying to hide. "I heard everything. Are you okay? Really okay?" Amara nodded, then shook her head, then nodded again, unable to articulate the complexity of what she was feeling. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and tired and relieved all at once. "I remembered what Mom said. About showing them who we are. About dignity and grace. I tried to do what she would have done." David Williams, billionaire CEO, one of the most powerful men in the transportation industry, lost all composure. He pulled his daughter back into his arms, his shoulders shaking with sobs. "She would be so proud. Baby girl, I am so proud. You were magnificent. You were everything she taught you to be and more." He held her tighter. "I'm sorry I wasn't there. I'm sorry you had to face that alone." But Amara pulled back, looked at her father, and said something that showed she understood far more than he'd expected. "I wasn't alone. I had Mrs. Chin and Malik and Mason. And you let me handle it first. Before you fixed it. Why?" David looked at his 10-year-old daughter, saw the question in her eyes, and recognized that she deserved a real answer. He guided all three children to some seats in the gate area, away from the crowds of passengers and gawkers. Mrs. Chen and Dorothy Freeman gave them space but stayed close. And David Williams, kneeling in front of his children, explained, "Do you understand why I handled it the way I did?" Amara thought about it, her sharp mind working through the sequence of events. "You wanted me to defend myself first. To know I could." David nodded, his expression serious. "Exactly. Baby girl, one day I won't be here to fix things for you. One day, you'll face injustice and I won't be able to make a phone call and solve it. And I needed to know, and you needed to know, that you could stand up for yourself. That you have power independent of me, independent of my money or my position." He took her hands in his voice intense with the importance of what he was saying. "You have power, baby girl. Real power. Not because of money, not because of who your father is, but because of who you are. Because of your intelligence, your courage, your character. Because you know your worth and you refuse to accept anything less than respect. The kind of power that no one can take from you. That's the kind of power your mother had. And you showed everyone on that plane that you have it too." He looked at Malik and Mason, including them in this moment. "All three of you. You are Williams' children. You come from strength and brilliance and resilience. You carry your mother's grace and my stubbornness." He smiled slightly at that. "And together, those things make you unstoppable. Don't you ever let anyone make you forget that." Amara pulled out her journal one more time. She opened to a fresh page, the last empty page in the book, and began to write. David watched, recognizing his late wife's journal, understanding the significance of his daughter using it to process this experience. She wrote, "Today I learned that standing up for yourself isn't about being loud or aggressive. It's about knowing your worth and refusing to let anyone diminish it. It's about staying calm when people want you to lose control. It's about dignity, grace, and the unshakable confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are. Mom taught me this. Today, I finally understood what she meant. Today, I became who she raised me to be." She closed the journal, held it against her chest, and felt at peace for the first time since boarding that plane in New York. The Williams family gathered their things and began walking through LAX, David with one twin on each side holding his hands, Amara walking beside him, Mrs. Chen and Dorothy Freeman following behind. As they walked, David asked more questions, getting the full story, his jaw tightening with anger at certain parts but his expression softening with pride at others. They were almost to the exit, almost to the car that would take them home, when Amara asked one more question. "Dad, what's going to happen to that woman? To Linda?" David's expression hardened. She's been permanently banned from Sky High Airlines and all our partner carriers, which is most major airlines in the US and Europe. Her name is on a no-fly list that the major carriers share. She'll have difficulty traveling for the foreseeable future. There may also be legal consequences depending on how the investigation proceeds. He paused, then added, but more importantly, the incident has been reported to her employer. She worked for a major consulting firm, and they've already begun their own investigation. Actions have consequences. She thought her privilege would protect her. She was wrong. Amara processed this, then asked quietly, "Do you think she learned anything?" David looked down at his daughter, struck by her empathy even towards someone who'd treated her so cruelly. "I don't know, baby girl. I hope so. But whether she learns or not isn't your responsibility. You did what you needed to do to protect yourself and your brothers. That's enough." They stepped out into the California sunshine, warm and bright and welcoming. A black SUV waited at the curb, and David's driver opened the doors for them. Before they got in, Dorothy Freeman touched Amara's arm gently. "I want you to have this." She pulled a small pin from her purse, worn and old but clearly precious. It was a simple design, a black fist raised in solidarity, surrounded by the words, "Freedom Now." "I wore this when I marched in Selma. It survived tear gas and police batons and 55 years of history. And now I want you to have it, to remind you that you're part of something bigger, that the fight continues, and you're strong enough to be part of it." Amara took the pin with trembling hands, understanding the magnitude of the gift. "I can't take this. It's too important." Dorothy smiled, her eyes twinkling. "That's exactly why you can take it. Because you understand its importance. Because you'll honor it. Keep fighting, baby girl. The world needs more people like you." They exchanged phone numbers, promises to stay in touch, and one more long hug. Then the Williams family climbed into the SUV, and as they pulled away from the curb, Amara looked out the window at Dorothy Freeman standing there, waving, a living connection to the past and a reminder of the work that still needed to be done. The screen would fade to black, and text would appear, white letters on a dark background, sharing what happened after that day. Linda Hutchinson was permanently banned from Sky High Airlines and all partner carriers in their network, effectively restricting her ability to fly on most major airlines. Her employer, a prominent consulting firm, terminated her contract following an internal investigation into discriminatory behavior. Sky High Airlines implemented mandatory anti-bias training for all staff within 30 days, with quarterly refresher courses and a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. Anonymous passenger complaints increased by 300% in the following months, as more people felt empowered to report discriminatory behavior. Jessica Martin, the flight attendant, kept her job but was required to complete additional training. She became one of the airline's most vocal advocates for passenger rights and anti-discrimination policies. Amara Williams continued to use her voice and her platform to advocate for kindness, equality, and justice. She spoke at her school, at community events, and eventually at national conferences about standing up to prejudice. The Williams family established the Grace Williams Foundation in honor of Amara's mother, providing support for children facing discrimination and funding anti-bias education programs. Dorothy Freeman and Amara remained close friends until Dorothy's passing 5 years later. Amara spoke at her funeral, honoring the woman who'd connected her personal experience to the larger movement for justice. Sometimes the most powerful thing a child can do is refuse to be small. The final image would be Amara, a bit older now, standing at a podium speaking to an audience, her mother's journal visible on the stand in front of her, Dorothy's pin attached to her lapel. Confident, articulate, powerful. A child who'd faced injustice and hadn't broken. Who'd grown into exactly the kind of person the world needed. So here's what I want to ask you. What would you have done in Amara's situation? Would you have stayed quiet to avoid conflict? Would you have called your parent immediately, or tried to handle it yourself first? Have you ever had to stand up for yourself or someone else in the face of prejudice or injustice? How did it feel? What did you learn? Share your stories in the comments below. Because these conversations matter. These experiences matter. And the more we talk about them, the more we acknowledge them, the harder it becomes for people like Linda Hutchinson to act without consequences. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you of the power we all have to stand up for what's right, then do 3 things for me. Hit that like button to help this story reach more people who need to hear it. Subscribe to this channel for more stories about courage, justice, and the power of standing up for what's right. And most importantly, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. With a child who's facing discrimination. With a parent who's teaching their kids how to navigate an unjust world. With anyone who needs a reminder that dignity and grace are not weakness, they're weapons. Because at the end of the day, this isn't just a story about one girl on one airplane. It's a story about all of us. About the choices we make when we witness injustice. About whether we stay silent or speak up. About whether we use whatever power we have, big or small, to make things a little bit better, a little bit fairer, a little bit more just. Amara Williams was 10 years old when she learned that her voice mattered. That her worth wasn't determined by other people's prejudices. That she could stand up for herself and her brothers and win. Not because her father was powerful, but because she was powerful. Because she refused to be made small. And that's a lesson every child deserves to learn. Every adult needs to remember. Every person should carry with them every single day. Thanks for watching. Now go out there and be like Amara. Stand tall. Know your worth. And never, ever accept anything less than respect. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. See you next time.